You know how some days just look ordinary from the outside? That's the thing about the day I want to tell you about. If you'd walked past the palace that morning, you'd have seen nothing. Tourists, flags, a man in a red coat standing so still you'd wonder if he was breathing. Just another Tuesday in Hollandcrest. But I was there, close enough. And I'm telling you what I saw that morning. I still think about it when I can't sleep. Let me start from the beginning, the proper beginning. It was late September. That in-between kind of weather where the sun's out but the wind hasn't got the message yet. I'd come to Hollandcrest on my own. My husband had passed the year before, and my daughter, bless her, kept saying, "Mum, you have to go somewhere, anywhere. You can't just sit in that house." So I booked a trip I couldn't really afford to a small kingdom I'd only ever seen on the telly because a woman I used to work with said the gardens there would put your heart back together. Her words, not mine. I didn't believe her, but I went anyway. The palace at Hollandcrest isn't the biggest you've ever seen. It's not one of those enormous stone things that make you feel like an ant. It's graceful, I suppose, pale gold in the morning. There's a long avenue of lime trees that leads up to the gates, and the branches had just started turning, so the whole path was this soft yellow-green, and the light came through in little coins on the ground. I remember thinking, standing there with my cheap coffee going cold in my hand, this is nice. That was all. This is nice. I hadn't thought anything was nice in a long while. There was a crowd already gathering by the gates. Not huge. Maybe 40, 50 people. A school group in matching caps. A couple of Americans with the biggest camera I'd ever seen. An older gentleman with a little dog tucked inside his coat, only its face poking out. And children. A lot of children that day for some reason. Half-term, maybe. I never found out. And the guards. There were two on duty at the front, one either side of the main gate. If you've never seen the Hollandcrest Guard up close, let me describe it because I want you to picture this properly. Deep red coats. Not fire engine red, darker, older looking like wine. Tall black caps. White gloves, spotless. Boots you could see the sky in. And the faces, that's the thing that gets you, the faces don't move. Not a twitch. Not a blink you'd notice. They stand there like they've been carved. The one nearest me was a big man. Not fat, just built. Broad through the shoulders. He looked to be maybe 40. There were a few lines by his eyes, the kind you get from squinting into weather for years. And there was something about the way he held himself. The younger guard across the gate stood well enough, but he had a stiffness to him, like he was trying. This older one wasn't trying. He just was. Solid as the gate itself. I found out later his name was Rennick. Sergeant Aldous Rennick. But that morning he was just the big one in my head. The tourists were doing what tourists do, standing beside him for photos, pulling faces. One lad, teenager, thought he was hilarious, kept getting closer and closer, trying to make him flinch, waving his hand, saying, "Oi, mate, you alive in there?" His friends were filming it on their phones, laughing. Rennick didn't move, not even his eyes. The boy gave up eventually and slouched off, and I remember one of the older women near me tutting and saying, "No manners, these young ones," and I nodded because you do, don't you? That was the mood of the place. Light, a bit silly, nothing coming. Then a car came up the avenue. Now I want to be careful how I tell this, because at the time none of us knew what we were looking at. It wasn't a big procession. No sirens, no motorcade, nothing you'd expect. Just a dark car, moving slow, and two others behind it. The crowd noticed straight away, you always do, the energy shifts, and everyone shuffled forward against the low railing, phones already up. Somebody near me whispered, "Is it her? Is it the little one?" And someone else said, "It's the memorial today. It's got to be for the memorial." I didn't know what memorial. I was a stranger there. But I gathered from the bits and pieces floating around the crowd that there'd been a loss in the royal family that year. The young queen, the mother, had died. I won't pretend I knew the details. It had been in the papers, apparently, but I'd been in my own fog that year and I'd missed most of the world. What I did understand from the hush that came over everyone was that the person in that car was the child, the little princess. Eloan, they were saying. Princess Elowen. She was 7, maybe 8, and it was her mother they were remembering that day. The car stopped just inside the gates, not right in front of us, off to the side near a smaller entrance, where a strip of dark green curtain had been hung between two posts. It was one of those privacy screens, the kind they put up so the family can get from the car to the door without every camera in the world catching them. Sensible thing. Kind thing, really. But there was a gap. There's always a gap. I happened to be standing at an angle, pure chance. I'd only moved to get out of the sun where I could see past the edge of that curtain. Just a sliver. And through that sliver I watched a small figure get out of the car. She was tiny. That's the first thing that hit me. On the telly, on the front pages, royalty always looks a certain size, doesn't it? Grand. But this was a little girl, and she was small even for a little girl, and she was wearing a dark coat that was slightly too big for her, the sleeves nearly swallowing her hands. Her hair was done up neat with a black ribbon. Somebody had clearly tried very hard to make her look ready. She didn't look ready, she looked lost. There were adults around her. A woman in gray, a nanny or an aide, I couldn't tell, holding her by the shoulder, guiding her. A tall man in a dark suit walking ahead. Everyone very brisk, very organized. And the little girl in the middle of it being moved along like a piece of luggage they were all being careful with. She stopped. Right there in the gap, just for a second, she stopped walking. And the woman in gray bent down and said something to her, low, and gave her shoulder a little squeeze, not unkind, just hurried, the squeeze you give when you're running behind. And I saw the child's face crumple, not into a big cry. Worse than that somehow. It was that face children make when they're trying so hard not to cry that their whole little mouth goes tight, and their chin wobbles, and they're just holding it, because someone's told them they have to be brave. I've seen that face on my own daughter, years ago at my mother's funeral when she was small. I know that face. It went right through me. And then she said something. I couldn't hear it. I was too far, and there was a wind, and the crowd was murmuring. But I saw her lips move, and I saw the woman in gray straighten up too fast, the way you do when a child says something that catches you off guard and you don't know what to do with it. The woman glanced around quick, almost embarrassed, and took the girl's hand and started walking again, faster now. And that would have been it. That would have been the whole story. A sad little glimpse through a gap in a curtain, a moment I'd have told my daughter about over the phone that night. Oh, the poor little thing, you should have seen her face. And then forgotten within a week. Except somebody else heard. Sergeant Rennick was closer than me. Much closer. He was posted only a few feet from where that curtain hung, at the corner of it, and the child had passed within arm's reach of him. He heard what she said. I know he heard because I was watching his face. I'd been watching his face all morning, honestly. There's something hypnotic about a man who won't move, and I saw it change. I need you to understand what a big thing that is. These men are trained not to move. It's the whole point of them. Tourists spend all day trying to break them, and they don't break. A teenager had been waving his hand in this man's face 20 minutes earlier, and he hadn't so much as blinked. But when that little girl said her words, something moved in his face. It wasn't much. If you hadn't been staring, you'd have missed it entirely. His jaw shifted, just slightly, like he'd swallowed something that hurt going down, and his eyes, which had been fixed on the middle distance on nothing the way they're supposed to be, his eyes dropped, for half a second, down and to the side, toward the child. Then they snapped back, and he was stone again. But I'd seen it, and a cold little feeling started up in my stomach, the kind you get when you know, without being told, that something's about to happen and you can't stop it. The girl and the woman in gray disappeared behind the far edge of the curtain, gone, off toward the door, out of sight. The crowd around me went back to its chatter. The moment passed for everyone else. Not for him. I watched him stand there, and I could see, I swear I could see, that he was fighting something. His chest rose and fell a little heavier than before. His gloved hands, which had been perfectly still at his sides, closed, just closed, into fists, slowly, like he was gripping onto his own discipline with everything he had. And I thought, he's not all right. Whatever that child said, it's undone something in him. Now here's where I have to tell you a bit about what I learned afterward, because at the time I didn't know any of it, and it only makes sense looking back. Sergeant Aldous Rennick had served the royal household for nearly 20 years. He'd been on the personal detail years before, when the young queen was still alive and still a princess herself. He'd known her, not as a friend, you understand, that's not how it works, but he'd stood outside her doors, escorted her carriage, been part of the furniture of her life for a long time. And more than that, and this is the part I only found out weeks later, from a woman who worked in the palace kitchens and who I got talking to in a cafe near my hotel, Rennick had lost his own child. Years before. A daughter. She'd been ill, and she'd died small, and he'd never really spoken of it to anyone, but everyone in the household sort of knew, the way you know these things about people you work near for years. So you can imagine, or maybe you can't, not fully, a man who'd lost his own little girl, standing guard at the memorial of a mother, watching that mother's little girl walk past him barely holding herself together. And then hearing what she said. I still didn't know what she'd said. Not yet. That comes later, and when I found out, it landed on me the way I think it landed on him. For now, all I knew was that the big guard by the gate was in some kind of quiet agony, and no one but me seemed to have noticed, and there was absolutely nothing I could do about it. I was a tourist behind a railing. I didn't even belong there. The ceremony or service or whatever it was must have started inside. We couldn't see it. The crowd thinned a little, people wandered off toward the gardens. The school group got herded away by a harassed-looking teacher. The man with the little dog moved on. But I stayed. I couldn't have told you why. Something kept me rooted to that spot by the railing, watching a man I'd never met stand guard over a door. The wind picked up. Those lime leaves came loose and skittered across the courtyard. It got colder. I pulled my coat tighter and told myself, 5 more minutes, then I'll go and find somewhere warm. I didn't go. Because after maybe half an hour, the curtain moved. Not the wind. Someone was coming back through it. And my heart did a funny little jump because I thought, she's coming out. It's over. She's leaving. And part of me, the soft, daft part, wanted to see the little girl one more time and somehow will her to be all right. But it wasn't the girl who came out first. It was the woman in gray. And she came out fast, and she came out worried. You could see it from 30 feet. Her head was turning left and right, and she was saying something to the man in the dark suit who'd appeared behind her, and the two of them were moving with that particular controlled panic that adults have when a child has gone somewhere they shouldn't, and everyone's trying very hard not to make a scene. I heard one word carry on the wind, just one. Eloan. And then again sharper, Eloan. The little princess was missing. I felt it go through the whole front of the palace like a current. The remaining guards, there were more of them now, appearing from doorways, from around corners, more red coats than I'd realized were even there. They all went from statues to men in about 2 seconds. Heads turning. Someone speaking into a collar. The easy morning gone just like that, replaced by something tight and urgent. A little girl, 7, maybe 8, grieving, gone missing at her own mother's memorial, in a palace full of corridors and gardens and locked rooms, with a wind getting colder by the minute. And I stood there behind my railing, useless, my cold coffee still in my hand, and I watched Sergeant Rennick. Because Rennick hadn't turned his head like the others. He hadn't started rushing. He'd gone very, very still, even stiller than before, if that's possible, and his eyes had lifted, and they were fixed on something. Not on the panicking adults, not on the door. On the curtain. That long, dark green privacy curtain hanging heavy between its 2 posts. It wasn't moving in the wind the way the leaves were. It hung too straight, too full, like there was something behind the lower part of it, weighing it, holding it. and I realized a half-second before he moved that I could see, at the very bottom edge of that curtain, where it should have hung clear of the ground, the tip of one small black shoe. She hadn't gone far at all. She'd gone about 10 feet. She'd slipped behind the curtain, the one thing in that whole courtyard that was made to hide people, and she'd tucked herself into the fold of it, small as she was, and she'd stayed there. While the adults ran the other way calling her name, while the guards spread out. She was right there, hidden in plain sight in the one place designed to make a person invisible. And Rennick had spotted her. I watched him make a decision. I actually watched it happen on his face, the same face that hadn't moved for a teenager waving in it, the same face trained for 20 years to stay carved. He looked at the curtain. He looked at the frantic adults who still hadn't seen. He looked, I'll never forget this, up toward a first-floor window where more of the household had appeared, watching, expecting their guard to hold his post, to stay a statue, to do the one thing his entire life had trained him to do. To not move. And then he moved. He broke his post. He stepped away from the gate, a thing I would later learn a Holland-Crest guard simply does not do, not without relief, not without command, not for anything. And he crossed the courtyard in 4 long strides, and he reached up, and with one gloved hand he took hold of that heavy green curtain. And he tore it away, he tore the curtain away. And for one long, awful second nobody moved. The whole courtyard just stopped. The adults who'd been calling her name froze mid-step. The guards who'd spread out went still again, but a different kind of still this time, the kind that comes from shock. Every eye swung toward the corner, toward the man in the wine-red coat standing over a heap of dark green fabric that pooled at his boots. And there she was, Princess Aloan, curled into the base of the post, knees up under her chin, that too big coat wrapped around her like she was trying to disappear inside it. Her ribbon had come loose on one side, so a bit of her hair hung down over her face. And she was crying. Not the loud kind. The silent kind, the kind where the tears just run and the child doesn't even bother wiping them, because what's the point, there's too many. She looked up at him. This enormous man who just ripped away the only thing hiding her. And here's the thing I braced myself for, standing there behind the railing. I thought, oh no, she's going to be frightened. He's huge, he's a stranger, he's just torn her hiding place open in front of everyone. She's going to scream or run, and the whole thing's going to get worse. But that's not what happened. Because Rennick didn't loom over her. The second the curtain was down and he saw her face, that big man went down, right down onto one knee on the cold stone so his eyes were level with hers, and he didn't grab her. He didn't haul her up and hand her back to the adults, which is what protocol would have wanted, I'm sure. He just knelt there, close but not touching, steady. And he said something to her. I couldn't hear it. I was too far, again, the story of my life that day, too far to hear the words that mattered, but I could see. I could see his mouth moving, slow and low, and I could see his face, which had been carved stone all morning, and it wasn't stone anymore. It was soft. It was the softest thing I'd seen all day. Whatever he was saying to her, he was saying it the way you'd say it to your own. And the little girl, she stopped trying to hide her face. She lifted her chin off her knees, and she looked at him properly, this stranger in red, and something in her face changed. That tight, holding it in look started to come apart, but gently, like he'd given her permission to stop being brave for a minute. The adults started to move in. The woman in gray came rushing. Relief and panic all mixed up on her face, her hands already out to scoop the child up. And Rennick, without even turning his head, without taking his eyes off Aloan, lifted one gloved hand, just held it up, a small gesture. Wait. And she waited. That's the part that still amazes me. A palace aide, someone with rank, someone whose whole job was that child. She stopped, because a guard on his knees held up a hand. She stopped because there was something in the way he was with the girl that told her plainly, don't. Not yet. Let him. So Rennick stayed down there on one knee and he talked to the little princess. And slowly, you could see it happen, she came out of the fold of the post. Not because anyone pulled her. because she wanted to. She unfolded herself, this tiny grieving thing, and she came the last little distance toward him on her own, and she put her forehead against his shoulder. And he let her. He didn't hug her, I think. Even then, some part of his training held, some sense of what you can and can't do, but he shifted, just so that his shoulder was there for her to lean on. And he let a princess cry into a red coat that was never, ever supposed to move. I'm not ashamed to say I cried too, standing there behind the railing with my stupid cold coffee. Half the crowd around me had gone quiet in that way crowds do when they realize they're seeing something they weren't meant to see, something too real for photographs, though God knows plenty of phones were up. Now, this is where I have to slow down and tell you about the forewords, because everything I've told you so far I saw with my own eyes. But the forewords, what the little girl actually said, back at the start in the gap in the curtain, the thing that broke Rennick's face for the first time that morning, I didn't hear those. I told you I didn't. I only found out later. And it took me weeks. I stayed in Hollandcrest longer than I'd planned. I couldn't have told you exactly why. The trip that was meant to put my heart back together had, instead, gone and cracked it open in a completely different place, and I wasn't ready to go home and sit in my quiet house again just yet. So I stayed. I wandered. And I did what nosy people do, I asked around. There was a cafe 2 streets back from the palace, one of those little places with steamed-up windows, and a woman behind the counter who knew everyone. I got talking to her over a good many cups of tea across a good many days. Her name was Marta. And Marta, it turned out, had a sister who worked in the palace kitchens. And through Marta, over about a fortnight, I got the pieces. The little queen, Aloan's mother, had been ill for a long time before she died. Months. And near the end she'd been kept in a wing of the palace where the child wasn't often allowed because they thought it was too much for a little girl to see her mother that way. Kind again. Everyone was always being so kind, so careful, so protective. And in all that carefulness, nobody had quite explained things to Aloan properly. She was 7. Nobody knew how. So she'd been shuffled around, kept busy, kept distracted, told her mummy was resting, told to be a good girl, told to be brave always, always to be brave. And then one day her mother was gone and there was a funeral, and now, months later, a memorial and this whole grand machine of grief moving around her. And nobody had ever really just sat down and let the child grieve. There was a woman named Camilla in the household. Not, I want to be clear because it matters, not anyone unkind. This is where the title of the thing gets it wrong. Honestly, the way these stories always get twisted in the retelling. Camilla wasn't a villain. Camilla was the girl's governess. An older woman, strict in the way that generation was strict, all chin up and we don't make a fuss, and your mother would want you to be strong. She thought she was helping. She thought that's what strength looked like. She'd probably been raised exactly that way herself. But to a 7-year-old who just lost her mum, be strong and don't make a fuss, and your mother would want you to be brave, said over and over every day, by the person now most in charge of her, that lands differently. That doesn't feel like strength. That feels like being told you're not allowed to be sad. That feels like your grief is a problem you're causing. And that morning, in the gap in the curtain, when the aide in gray had squeezed her shoulder and hurried her along toward the memorial for her own mother, Aloan had said her 4 words. She'd said, "Camilla, it hurts." That was it. That was the whole thing, not an accusation, not a cry against some cruelty. Just a little girl at the door of her mother's memorial quietly telling the name of the person who was supposed to comfort her that the thing inside her hurt, that she couldn't hold it anymore. It hurts, please. It hurts. And the aide, flustered, running behind, hadn't known what to do with it and had hurried her on. But Rennick had heard. And now, knowing what I know about his own daughter, about the little grave he never spoke of, now I understand why his face broke. A man who'd lost his own child, hearing another man's child say it hurts and watching the grown-ups walk her past it. Of course that undid him. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. Let me go back to the courtyard because the moment wasn't over. So there's Rennick on one knee, and Aloan leaning into his shoulder, and the whole household frozen around them not knowing what to do. And into that silence walked Camilla herself. I picked her out straight away, though I didn't know her name yet. An older woman, gray hair pinned severe, dark coat buttoned to the throat, a face set hard but not cruel hard, frightened hard. The hard face people put on when they're scared they've done something wrong and can't bear to look at it. She came out from behind the far side, saw the guard on his knee and the child in his shadow, and I watched her whole body go rigid. "Sergeant," her voice carried, thin and sharp on the wind. "Sergeant, that is quite enough. Return to your post." Rennick didn't move. "Sergeant Rennick," sharper now, "you will return the princess to my care and return to your post immediately." And still he didn't move. He stayed down at the child's level, one knee on the cold stone, and the little girl's hand had found the edge of his sleeve and was gripping it, this fistful of red wool, holding on. The courtyard was so quiet you could hear the leaves. Then Rennick spoke, and this time, because the wind had dropped or because he'd raised his voice just enough or because everyone had gone so still, this time I heard him. We all heard him. He didn't shout. That's what I remember. A man that size in that moment with all that feeling in him, he didn't shout. He said it low and level and clear, still looking at the child, not at the governess. He said, "She's not being difficult, ma'am. She's 7 years old and she's just told you it hurts." And then he did look up. He turned his head and he looked at Camilla and he said, "The least we can do is let her say so." I want to tell you that Camilla crumbled right then, that there was some grand collapse, some tearful apology the way these stories go. It wasn't like that. Real life isn't like that. What actually happened was that the old woman's mouth opened and then closed, and her hard, frightened face went through something. A flicker. Because I don't think, in all the months of doing what she thought was her duty, chin up, be brave, don't make a fuss, I don't think anyone had ever once said it to her plainly like that. That the child was hurting. That being strong and being all right are not the same thing, and she'd been demanding the first while a little girl drowned in the second. She didn't crumble, but she didn't order him again either. She just stood there, and something behind her eyes shifted, and I genuinely think, that was the moment a careful, well-meaning, wrong old woman started very slightly to understand what she'd been getting wrong. But the situation wasn't resolved. Not yet, because there were other people in that courtyard, and not all of them were moved by a guard on his knee. The man in the dark suit, the tall one who'd walked ahead of the girl at the start, he came forward now, and he was not soft. He was household security, I found out later, senior. And to him, what he was seeing wasn't a tender moment. It was a serious breach. A guard had abandoned his post, torn down palace fixtures, physically interposed himself between a royal child and her appointed guardian, and defied a direct instruction from a senior member of the household staff, in public, in front of cameras. By the book, that's about as serious as it gets. "Sergeant, on your feet, flat, cold, no feeling in it at all. You're relieved, step away from the princess, now." And I felt the whole thing tip toward disaster, because I could see it. Rennick had done a beautiful, human, decent thing, and it was going to cost him everything. His post, his career, 20 years of service, gone because he couldn't stand to watch a grieving child be told to be brave one more time. The rules didn't have a box for what he'd done. The rules just saw a broken post and a defied order. Rennick heard the security man. His jaw tightened, and I watched him understand in that moment exactly what it was going to cost him. You could see it settle over him. He knew. And he stayed down anyway. He looked at the little girl one more time, and he said something to her, quiet just for her. I couldn't catch it, and she nodded, this small brave nod, and she let go of his sleeve, finger by finger, like it cost her something too. Then Sergeant Aldous Rennick stood up. He came up to his full height, and the courtyard seemed to shrink around him, and he squared his shoulders and set his eyes back on the middle distance, on nothing, the way he'd been trained. Back to stone. And he took one step back from the child and then another, and he stood at attention, ready to be marched off, ready to lose all of it. And that's when the last thing happened, the thing none of us saw coming, the thing that changed everything. A window opened. Up on the first floor, that same window I'd seen faces at earlier, the household watching their guard, expecting him to hold his post. A tall window, and it swung open, and a man leaned out. An older man, gray at the temples. And even from the courtyard, even not knowing the family, I understood at once from the way every single person in that space turned and went rigid and lowered their heads. I understood that this was someone who mattered more than all the rest of them put together. It was the king. Eloin's grandfather, the old king of Hollencrest, who'd been inside at the memorial for his daughter-in-law, for the mother of his grandchild. He'd been at the window. He'd been watching. How long, I don't know, but long enough. And in the frozen silence of that courtyard, with a guard standing at attention waiting to be ruined, and a security man waiting to ruin him, and a governess with her wrong certainties cracking, and a little girl with her tear-streaked face turned up toward the window, the old king looked down at all of it. And he spoke. The old king looked down at the courtyard for a long moment, and nobody breathed. I've thought about that pause a lot since, because a king up at a window looking down at a mess like that, a broken post, a defied order, a guard about to be marched off in disgrace, a king could have gone either way. He could have backed his security man. Order is order. The whole palace runs on it. One guard deciding for himself when the rules apply, and when they don't, that's the sort of thing that, if you let it go, unravels everything. I understood that even standing there. I understood there was a version of the next 30 seconds where the king said, "The sergeant is quite right to be relieved." And that was that. But he'd been watching. That was the thing. He hadn't just walked out into the middle of it and been handed a security man's version of events. He'd been at that window, and he'd seen the whole of it, from the curtain coming down to the guard on his knee to the little hand gripping the red sleeve. And he'd heard, I think, what Rennick said, about the child telling them it hurts, and the least they could do was let her say so. The king spoke, and his voice wasn't loud, but it carried the way an old man's voice carries when everyone's already silent and straining to hear him. He said, "Leave him be." Just that, 3 words, and you could feel the whole courtyard exhale. The security man, to his credit, didn't argue. He inclined his head, stepped back, and the cold went out of him. Whatever the rule book said, there was a higher rule now, and it had just leaned out of a first-floor window and spoken. Then the king said something else. He looked down, not at the guard, not at the security man, not at the governess, at the little girl, at Eloin, his granddaughter, standing there in her too big coat with her ribbon half undone and her face wet. And he said, "Bring her up to me, and bring the sergeant." Now I didn't see what happened upstairs. Obviously, I was a tourist behind a railing. I never set foot inside that palace, and I never will. So this next part I got the same way I got the 4 words, in pieces, over cups of tea from Marta, whose sister worked in the kitchens and heard it from the people who'd been in the room. So take it as that, secondhand. But I believe it because it fits everything I saw with my own eyes. They brought Eloin and Rennick up to a small private room off the main hall. The king was there, and a few others, the governess Camilla among them, and the security man, and 1 or 2 of the household who'd been at the memorial. And the old king, they say, did a thing that surprised everyone. He didn't start with the guard. He didn't start with the breach or the rules or any of it. He got down, an old man, stiff in the knees. They said it took him a moment. He got down to Eloin's level, the way Rennick had in the courtyard, and he took his granddaughter's hands in his, and he asked her one question. He asked, "Is it true what you said, that it hurts?" And the little girl, who had spent months being told to be brave, being told her mother would want her to be strong, being hurried past her own grief by kind, careful, well-meaning people who couldn't bear to look at it. The little girl looked at her grandfather, the king, the most important person in her whole world, and she must have been so frightened that the answer was wrong. But she nodded. She said yes, it hurts. And then they say she said the thing that finished it. She said, I miss Mummy and nobody will let me. Nobody will let me. Marta cried when she told me that part. I cried hearing it. I'm not going to pretend I didn't. And the old king, this man who'd lost his own child, his daughter-in-law, his son's wife, who'd been sitting through a memorial holding all of that in because kings don't fall apart in public either. The old king pulled his granddaughter into his arms and held her. And he said, they told me, then we'll let you. From now on, we'll let you. That was the turn. That was the whole thing turning. Because here's what I've come to understand about that day. The story everybody tells, the story in the title, the dramatic one, Royal Guard tears away the curtain. It makes it sound like there was a villain. Like Camilla was cruel and the guard was the hero who exposed her. And that's not it. That's never it in real life. There was no villain. There was a whole household of people who loved a little girl and were so busy protecting her from her grief that they'd forgotten she needed to be allowed to have it. Kindness pointed in exactly the wrong direction. It happens in ordinary families every day. It happened in mine once, and it took me years to see it. What Rennick did wasn't expose a villain. What he did was tell the truth out loud in a place where everyone had agreed, very gently, not to. He said the child is hurting and you're not letting her show it. And he said it knowing it would probably cost him his career, because he'd learned the hard way, the hardest way there is, what it costs a person to swallow that kind of grief. He'd learned it beside a little grave he never spoke of. So now, what happened to him? I'll tell you because I know that's the part you're waiting for. I waited for it too. He wasn't dismissed. The security man's report still had to be filed. The rules are the rules, and a post was broken, and that goes on paper whatever anyone feels about it. But the king wrote something too, and the king's word in Hollencrest tends to outweigh a report. Rennick was given a formal note on his record for leaving his post, and in the same breath, near enough, he was moved. They took him off the front gate. They made him the princess's personal guard. Marta's sister said it was a Lowen who asked for it, that in the days after, whenever anyone tried to move her along or hurry her past something or tell her to be brave, she'd ask for the big one. The one who'd let her lean on his shoulder. The one who told a room full of grown-ups that it was all right to say it hurts. And the king, who had decided a little late, but he'd decided that from now on this child would be listened to, said fine. Give her the big one. So Sergeant Aldous Rennick, who'd nearly lost everything for breaking his post, spent the next years of his life standing guard over the little girl he'd knelt in front of on the cold stone, walking her to school, standing outside her door, being the solid thing in the corner of the room, the one who never told her to be anything other than what she was. A man who'd lost his own daughter, given another little girl to watch over. I don't know if you believe in things working out. I'm not sure I did before that September. I'd come to Hollencrest a widow with a cracked heart, sent by a friend who promised the gardens would put me back together, and I never even made it to the gardens. I spent my whole trip drinking tea in a steamed-up cafe, chasing the pieces of a story about a guard and a little girl, because I couldn't let it go. And I understand now why I couldn't let it go. It was the face. Eloan's face in the gap in the curtain, tight and wobbling, holding it in because someone had told her she had to be brave. I knew that face. I'd seen it on my own daughter years ago at a funeral when she was small, and I was so busy being strong for both of us that I never once knelt down and told her it was all right to fall apart. I'd been Camilla. Kind, careful, well-meaning, and wrong. And I'd spent years not seeing it. That's what a stranger in a red coat gave me without ever knowing my name. He knelt down in a courtyard and said the thing out loud, and it reached all the way back through my own life and showed me the thing I'd got wrong with my own little girl, 30 years too late to do it differently, but not, it turned out, too late to phone her that night and say I was sorry, which I did, from the cafe. Marta lent me the quiet corner and pretended not to listen. I went home a week later. The gardens never did put my heart back together. A guard did. I saw him one more time before I left. Went back to the gates on my last morning half hopping. And there he was, not on the front gate anymore but crossing the courtyard, and beside him, holding his hand, was a little girl in a coat that fit her properly now. Her ribbon was straight, and she was talking, chattering away up at him about something, the way children do when they finally feel safe enough to be children again. And he was listening, stone-faced to anyone who didn't know better, but listening. He didn't see me. Why would he? I was just a face in a crowd, one of 1,000 tourists who'd passed his post. He never knew what he did for me. Most of the people who change our lives never do. But as they crossed the courtyard, the little princess said something, and I saw the big man's face move, just slightly. That same softening at the jaw I'd seen on the worst morning. And then, I'd swear to it, the smallest smile. There and gone. The kind you'd miss if you weren't looking. I was looking. And I thought, standing there one last time with a fresh coffee going cold in my hand, everybody's carrying something. That still man in the red coat had been carrying a grave he never spoke of. That careful old governess had been carrying a fear of doing it wrong. That little girl had been carrying more than any 7-year-old should ever have to. And me, I'd been carrying 30 years of a moment I couldn't take back. We're all just standing at our posts, aren't we, holding still, trying not to let it show. And every so often, if we're very lucky, somebody kneels down beside us and tears the curtain away, and lets us finally say the thing we've been holding in all along. It hurts. And that's allowed. That was always allowed. I just wish somebody had told me sooner.